Let's jump right into this explainer with a question that is, quite honestly, completely heartbreaking. I mean, picture a mother standing in front of a pair of unworn white school shoes. They belong to her murdered son, Dong-ho. And looking at those shoes, she asks one simple, agonizing thing. Why? Why did a 15-year-old boy stay in such a dangerous place when he could have just come home? Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're respectfully navigating some incredibly profound emotional source material based on Hong Kong's Human Acts. We're diving into this imaginary yet deeply raw dialogue between the survivors and the victims of the 1980 Gwangju Uprising. And through this beautifully constructed conversation, we're going to explore the real internal logic of trauma, memory, and, the massive burdens placed on the people who are left behind.
Now, because we're dealing with some heavy, deeply philosophical concepts today, we've broken this narrative down into 5 distinct chapters to kind of act as our psychological roadmap. The gathering at Gwangju, the choice to stay, the weight of survival, the right to silence, and finally, forgiveness and the dead.
So, let's just get right into it with Chapter 1, The Gathering at Gwangju.
To really understand this, we have to look at the tragic progression of events. Back in May 1980, the military fired on citizens who were calling for democracy in Gwangju. Days later, a young boy named Dong-ho stayed behind in a provincial office gymnasium to help volunteers identify bodies. He was ultimately killed. Fast forward decades later, and the source text brings us to this spiritual reckoning, an imaginary conversation that reunites the living and the dead so they can finally speak.
I want you to really picture this setting. It's an eerie, candlelit gymnasium. It's filled with empty tables, and there are just these name cards waiting for the unidentified. The characters gather here in the dark, and the focus isn't on sweeping historical statements, but on these very ordinary, intimate details. Like Dong-ho's mother doesn't just remember a casualty of history, she remembers her boy who used to pretend to eat his radish soup just to keep her happy, literally right before the violence stole his future.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, The Choice to Stay. Now, this contrast here is absolutely crucial because it completely shatters our polite societal cliches. History books, they love to label a murdered child a courageous young martyr, but to a grieving mother, he's just a child who should have come home. The text really challenges us to see that slapping the label of hero on a child often just hides the massive failure of the adults and the institutions that were supposed to protect him in the first place. Let's just pause here for a second to really feel the weight of this revelation. See, Dong-ho stayed behind because he was desperately looking for his friend, Jong-dae, who had been shot in the street. And Dong-ho carried this immense, crushing guilt for running away from the gunfire. But here, the spirit of Jong-dae corrects him. He reveals that his dying wish, his final thought as a living person, was actually for Dong-ho to run faster, to save himself.
So the big takeaway here is that Dong-ho was never trying to be some political martyr. He stayed to honor his dying friend, spending his final hours obeying what was essentially a tragic miscommunication. Friendship didn't require dying right beside him. At the end of the day, Dong-ho was just a terrified 15-year-old boy who, in his final moments, really just wanted his mom.
Let's move into Chapter 3, The Weight of Survival. This is where we see the truly agonizing reality faced by the people who actually lived through the massacre.
In the text, we meet Jin-soo, a survivor of horrific torture who carries these very specific invisible scars. He developed this intense, irrational fear of closed doors. He felt deep, debilitating shame whenever anyone showed him kindness, and he couldn't even endure a fleeting moment of happiness without intense guilt. Basically, his torturers taught his own mind to act as the guard of its own prison, long after he was physically released.
Jin-soo's words here are just incredibly haunting. They show us that for him, survival didn't feel like a rescue at all. It felt like a cruel, ongoing punishment. Survival wasn't a gift. It was this incredibly heavy weight he dragged behind him, day after day. He literally believed that his survival was a theft, that every breath he took was stolen directly from the boys who died. And tragically, he just couldn't escape that prison inside his mind. Even the simplest, most beautiful memories, like eating cold watermelon by a river or having a little girl in a yellow dress fall asleep on his shoulder on a bus, those moments brought him immense shame. He felt like the dead were actively judging his every moment of joy. And that unbearable weight ultimately led to his suicide after 9 agonizing years.
This heavy reality brings us to a profound philosophical question in Chapter 4, The Right to Silence.
Here we meet Youngju, and she completely redefines the whole concept of testimony for us. She draws a very strict, critical boundary between willingly sharing your story and having researchers eagerly extract your pain to put in their historical records. To her, when academics or historians demand the worst details of her trauma just for the sake of history, it doesn't feel like truth-telling. It feels like a theft.
This line is such a powerful climax for this section. My body belongs to me before it belongs to history. I mean, wow. Youngju is outright demanding that writers, historians, all of us really, need to ask permission. We can't just blindly assume that forcing a survivor to dig up their worst nightmare is automatically this virtuous, noble act.
We also see this idea through Yoon-suk, who carries this heavily censored manuscript. The thick black lines literally represent the spaces where the truth was erased. But Senju argues that silence itself speaks. Sometimes, actually honoring a survivor means allowing their silence to exist without forcing it into a neat little transcript. It means valuing their ordinary human joys, like Senju's fond memory of borrowing soft persimmons over a neighbor's wall with her sister, instead of strictly defining them by the violence they survived.
And finally, Chapter 5, Forgiveness and the Dead. Now, as promised, we are only covering the first 4 topics in this explainer today, so we won't be heavily unpacking this final chapter right now. But
I do want to point out that the text leaves us with this piercing, almost impossible question. Can the dead actually forgive the living? This final section briefly explores that haunting dissonance between a survivor like Jinsu's crippling self-punishment and the surprising grace, the actual feelings of the dead, like Jung-dae, who actually harbors no blame for the living.
it forces us to ask whether forgiveness can ever truly replace truth, accountability, or a real confession. Because the dead, they absolutely refuse to be just silent symbols.
And all of this builds to one final incredibly provocative thought from Dong-ho that just pierces right through history. He asks, what must the living do so none of us are abandoned again?
It's a question that really sticks with you, right? So, to uncover the answers to these questions, to read all about that final chapter, and to really explore the rest of this profound conversation, you've got to visit the link on your screen, imaginarytalks.com/han-kong-human acts. It is absolutely worth your time. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I'll see you next time.